Let's go back to the slideshow here for a moment. Let's start off by reading this slide again, okay? The CIS is the Consumer Information Statement. It's safe to give to everyone you intend to do business with, even though it's only required that you give it to the owners and renters and buyers of residential real estate transactions. It is not required for short-term rentals less than 125 days, which are considered seasonal rentals, or for commercial buildings or apartment buildings, multi-unit apartment buildings. The CIS is a disclosure of business relationships. It describes how your agency intends to work with or represent somebody. And it's the first document you give to anyone you intend to do business with. You give it to them and explain it to them even before you discuss their financial situation or their motivation, their reasons to move, whether they're selling or buying. And if you're going to put this on legal size paper, you could fold it as a brochure and have a blank cover and a blank back, but make sure that it's no less than a 12-point font size. The text cannot be shrink down on this form. Okay, so here is that second page of the CIS form. I tell people to highlight this. You may obtain legal advice about these business relationships from your own lawyer, but the statement is not a contract and is provided for informational purposes only. By having you sign it, I'm just asking you to acknowledge receipt of the CIS form, the Consumer Information Statement, because we're required to give it to people, and we don't want them later on saying that we never gave it to them. So we give them one copy, and we keep a copy for ourselves that they signed, so that we could prove and show that we actually went over it with them. Now, the Consumer Information Statement, this is the actual form. We're going to go over this right now. It says right here at the top, Consumer Information Statement on business relationships in New Jersey. So let's read through this. It says, in New Jersey, real estate licensees are required to disclose how they intend to work with buyers and sellers in a real estate transaction. In rental transactions, the term buyers and sellers should also include tenants and landlords, respectively. So as a seller's agent or subagent, I, as a licensee, represent the seller, and all material information supplied to me by the buyer will be told to the seller. So basically, if they've violated their fiduciary duty on the other side and told us something in confidence, we have a duty of disclosure notice. We have to go report that back to our seller if we're representing the seller. Now, if you're working as a buyer's agent, any information that the seller's agent tells you, we have a duty, fiduciary duty, to go back and report that back to our buyer that we're working with, because that is our fiduciary obligation of disclosure. But once again, we're only going to learn things that we need to report back if they violated their fiduciary duties, if the other agent in the transaction violated their fiduciary duties and didn't keep their mouth shut for something that their client told them in confidence. But otherwise, other things too, we report back to our clients, like if we find out about problems in a house and stuff like that, we have a duty to go back and report it. Anything that they would find important and could affect their decision in purchasing. Now, as a disclosed dual agent, there's nothing wrong with dual agency. That means that your agency is representing both parties in a transaction. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's got to be disclosed. So as long as both the buyer and seller are aware of the fact that your agency is representing both parties in the transaction, it's okay. But then you also have to take it a step further, and you need to get them to give you the implicit permission now to work as a dual agent. So at this time, so let me read this part first. So as a disclosed dual agent, I as a licensee represent both parties. However, I may not, without express permission, disclose that the seller will accept a price less than the listing price or that the buyer will pay a price greater than the offered price. Because you're representing both parties in the transaction, you may have that information from both parties, but you can't go back and blabbing that information to the other because you're representing both parties. You can't put one's interest over the other and play favorites. Basically, that's all that that's saying. So now, when are you acting as a disclosed dual agent? Well, if your agency is representing both parties in the transaction, it could be you as an individual agent are working with both the seller or the buyer, but it doesn't have to be the seller and the buyer, but it doesn't have to be. It could be you're representing the seller in the transaction and another agent from your office is working with the buyer, but you both work for the same company. You're under the same roof, the same agency umbrella, working for the same broker. So therefore, your agency is representing both parties in the transaction because you're a representative of the broker. And both of those clients are the brokers. So the broker is representing them both. So ergo, it is dual agency. Now, in order to work as a dual agent, it's not enough just to tell people that you're going to be working as a dual agent. You need to get their implicit permission to work as one. So here is a sample of the informed consent to dual agency agreement. There's 4 versions of this form, one for a seller, or sometimes I've seen 2 versions where they put seller / landlord, but one for the seller, one for a landlord, one for the buyer, one for the tenant. And so on this one's for the seller. You put the property address here. And this basically explains that you have a duty and obligation normally to go back and report things to the other side if you're working as a dual agent. And dual agents have to keep confidential any information that their clients tell them because they're representing both parties in the transaction. They can't go and place one party's interest over the other. But there's that risk that the agent could possibly do that. And so that's what this form actually just discloses. Be careful what you disclose to your agent so that they don't go blabbing it to the other side, even though they're legally not allowed to, and you could sue the hell out of them if they do. Okay, so because they violated their fiduciary duties to you. So that's basically what this form says. Let's read through it and see. So this agreement evidences seller's consent that the brokerage firm, as a seller's agent, may act as a disclosed dual agent in order to represent both the seller and the buyer in the real estate transaction, and seeks seller's consent to allow the seller's agent to act as a disclosed dual agent. You need to get their implicit permission to work as a dual agent. It's not enough just to tell them you're going to be working that way. So when the opportunity arises. Now, the seller should be aware that the real estate licensee may legally act as a disclosed dual agent only with the seller and the buyer's informed written permission, their consent. So the seller understands, here, let me highlight this, make it a little bit easier, know where I'm at. The seller understands that disclosed dual agency representing more than one party in a transaction has the potential of creating a conflict of interest. Yeah, if the agent doesn't know how to keep their mouth shut, that's the only time. So if both the seller and the buyer may intend to rely on the seller's agent advice, and their respective interests may be adverse to each other. Therefore, when acting as a disclosed dual agent, the seller's agent will not represent the interest of buyers to the exclusion or detriment of the interest of the seller, or vice versa. Basically, this is what it's saying. So in other words, you can't place one party's interest above another, right? So next paragraph. As a disclosed dual agent of both the seller and the buyer, seller's agent will be working equally for both parties in the real estate transaction and will provide services to complete the transaction without the full range of fiduciary duties ordinarily owed by an agent. So you can't provide that full level of loyalty where if you find out something about the other side, you have to report it back to the other. Now, normally, even in your normal transaction where there's 2 agents from different companies there, the other agent should know better than to disclose anything that their client told them in confidence. That's what they're explaining here, is only if that agent were to knowingly violate their fiduciary duties and tell you something that their client told them in confidence that they weren't supposed to share with you, that you then have a duty to report it back to your client, and now they could take advantage of that. Okay, so that's what they mean here by you're not going to gain that advantage. It should never be an advantage to begin with. So the seller alone or the buyer, let's see, so where did I leave off here? Seller alone or the buyer alone, who represents the seller alone or buyer alone. Okay. In the preparation of offers and counter offers between the seller and the buyer, the seller's agent will act only as an intermediary to facilitate the transaction rather than act as an active negotiator representing either the seller or the buyer in a fiduciary capacity. By consenting to this dual agency, the seller is giving up the right to undivided loyalty and will be owed only limited duties of disclosure by the seller's agent. I already just finished explaining that. Yeah, normally you would never find out anything anyway unless the other agent violated their fiduciary duties, and then you'd have a duty to disclose that to your client. But that should not be an advantage because it shouldn't be happening anyway. So it's not like you're gaining or losing anything really, except for if the other side did something they weren't supposed to. So, for example, the seller acknowledges that seller's agent as a disclosed dual agent is not permitted under law to disclose to either seller or buyer any confidential information that has been or will be communicated to the buyer's agent by either party. Okay, so basically they're going over this again and again and again, and that's all this form does. And then you as the licensee, you put your name here, the brokerage that you work for over here as well. You sign, and the where is it? You sign and the seller signs. Okay. And then we also have the informed consent to dual agency for a buyer / tenant. And this basically goes over the same thing. It just describes all the same, it's all the same text, just saying it from the perspective of a buyer. You know, that they can't place one party's interest above the other. You put your name here, your brokerage's name, once again here, you sign, and the buyer sign here. And you give them a copy of that, the duplicate original, we call that. And you keep one for your records as well. That's all that's about. Okay, so let's go back to the CIS form and finish reading and explaining that. Now, there's nothing in the law that states that you have to work in an agency capacity as a buyer's agent, seller's agent, or disclosed dual agent. As a transaction broker, I, as a licensee, do not represent either the buyer or the seller, and all information I acquire from one party may be told to the other. So before you disclose any confidential information to a real estate licensee regarding real estate transactions, you know, it is helpful to know, are they actually representing your interests or someone else's? Who is the agent representing at this point before you start telling them things about your finances, your motivation and reasoning to move? I have to sell because I'm going to get foreclosed on, or my job is relocated, or there's a sense of urgency, because that could be used against you if that agent's not representing you. So it's important for you to find out right from the onset of that relationship, are they going to be representing me or someone else or both of us or neither of us before I start giving them this kind of information. This is why the law requires the CIS be given and explained to people first thing before you ever go over their finances or motivations. Okay, so before you disclose confidential information to a real estate licensee regarding the real estate transaction, you should understand what type of business relationship you have with that licensee. There are 4 types: seller's agent, buyer's agent, disclosed dual agent, and a transaction broker. And each of these relationships impose certain legal duties and responsibilities on the licensee, as well as the seller or the buyer who's being represented. These 4 relationships are defined in greater detail below in the rest of this form, which we're about to go over right now. So let's start off with the seller's agent. A seller's agent works only for the seller. and has legal obligations called fiduciary duties. Those are the legal obligations we owe to our clients when you're working in the capacity as an agent, buyer's agent, seller's agent, or disclosed dual agent. And if you violate those fiduciary duties, you can be held legally responsible to them and financially if they sue you. So these are called fiduciary duties to the seller. These include reasonable care. So now we're going to go over what are our fiduciary duties. I give you guys an acronym COLD, COALD. Care, obedience, accounting, loyalty, and disclosure. So loyalty includes confidentiality. Disclosure includes notice. Anything you find out, you have to notify your client about. Because in the eyes of the law, when you work as an agent, the law considers anything told to the agent, your client already knows because you have a legal responsibility to report it to them. That's notice. So sellers agents often work with buyers, but they do not represent the buyers. However, in working with buyers, a seller's agent must act honestly. In dealing with both parties, the seller's agent may not make any misrepresentations to either party on matters material to the transaction. We need to treat everybody fairly and honestly. We can't lie. Such as the buyer's financial ability to pay, and must disclose defects of a material nature affecting the physical condition of the property, which a reasonable inspection by the licensee would disclose. And seller's agents include all persons licensed with the brokerage firm, because you're all representatives of the broker. And it's not who you as an individual represent. You represent the broker. It's who your agency represents. That's why they call this agency representation. So, which has been authorized through a listing agreement to work as a seller's agent. In addition, other brokerage firms may accept an offer to work with the listing broker's firm as a seller's agent. In such cases, those firms and all persons associated with that firm are called subagents. A subagent is an agent of an agent. You're an agent of your broker, you're a subagent. But this is talking about subagency where it could be another company. You have an agent that they're working with somebody as a buyer, but in reality, they're representing the seller because the buyer doesn't want representation. So that agent could also represent the seller in the transaction. In that case, it's called subagency. And that was popular in the 90s, not so much anymore these days. So the sellers who do not desire to have their property marketed through subagents should so inform the seller's agent. So that they make sure that nobody does that. All right, now a buyer's agent works only for the buyer. You're only working for the buyer. So a buyer's agent has fiduciary duties only to the buyer, which include reasonable care, undivided loyalty, your fiduciary duties, COLD, care, obedience, accounting, loyalty, disclosure. So over here, they just word it in a different way. Care, undivided loyalty, confidentiality, and full disclosure. However, in dealing with sellers, a buyer's agent must act honestly. In dealing with both parties, a buyer's agent may not make any misrepresentations on matters material to the transaction. See, all this stuff is just like with a seller's agent, except it's flipped the script for a buyer now, such as a buyer's financial ability to pay, and must disclose defects of a material nature affecting the physical condition of the property, which a reasonable inspection may have uncovered. A buyer's wishing to be represented by a buyer's agent is advised to enter into a separate written agency contract with the brokerage firm, which is to work as their agent. Now, even though you're representing the buyer, if it turns out that the buyer can't get the loan, you still need to treat the other parties in the transaction fairly and honestly, and you have to let the other side know that the buyer's having trouble getting a loan. You can't expect them to keep their property off of the market because you placed an offer on the property that they accepted, knowing that they're probably not going to be able to get the loan to buy the house to go through with the transaction. And then the seller's keeping their property off the market thinking that they can. So we have to treat all parties fairly and honestly in the transaction and disclose to them that the buyer is having trouble getting a loan right now. And then the sellers have to decide what to do. Same thing if the buyer bounces the deposit check. We have a fiduciary duty to our clients, but we also have to treat the other side fairly and honestly. And we have to let them know that the money that we said when we made the offer that we have on deposit in our escrow account, our brokerage escrow account, it's actually not there because the buyer bounced the check. Now, there could be legitimate reasons why that happened and it was just an honest mistake, but either way, that could be bad for the transaction. But we still need to do it because we got to treat everybody fairly and honestly. All right, now working as a disclosed dual agent, the agency represents both parties in the transaction, not necessarily the particular one single agent. You, as a salesperson, you could be working with a seller and you never met the buyer. But either way, another agent in your office who works for the same broker is representing the buyer. So your agency, your company is representing both parties in the transaction. Ergo, it is dual agency. Now, there's nothing wrong with dual agency once again, but undisclosed dual agency is illegal. So as long as it is disclosed, there's no problem with it. So disclose, disclose, disclose. Nobody's getting disadvantaged or getting taken advantage of if you disclose that. So a disclosed dual agent works for both parties in the transaction, the seller and the buyer. And to work as dual agent, a firm must first obtain an informed written consent of dual agency for both the buyer and the seller. So I just went over those two forms with you, the ones for the buyer and the one for the seller. Therefore, before acting as a disclosed dual agent, brokerage firms must make written disclosure to both parties. Disclosed dual agency is most likely to occur when a licensee, when a real estate firm working as a buyer's agent shows the buyer's properties owned by the seller for whom that firm is also working as a seller's agent or a sub-agent. So a real estate licensee working as a disclosed dual agent must carefully explain to each party that, in addition to working as their agent, the firm is also representing the other party in the transaction, on the other side of the transaction. So they must also explain what effect their working as a disclosed dual agent will have on their fiduciary duties. Yeah, basically, if the other person tells me something in confidence, I can't come back and tell it to you if I find out about that information, and vice versa, because I can't put one party's interest over the other. Is that taking advantage of somebody? Is somebody going to benefit from that or lose out because of that? No. Because even if it was a different company, a different agency, that agent should have never disclosed to me something that their client told them in confidence either. So when working as a disclosed dual agent, a brokerage firm must have an express permission of a party prior to disclosing confidential information. So you're going to need to get it in writing if you do want to disclose any of that confidential information. Such information includes the highest price a buyer can afford to pay and the lowest price that a seller will accept, and the party's motivations to buy or sell. Remember, a brokerage firm acting as a disclosed dual agent will not be able to put one party's interest ahead of the other. They cannot advise or counsel either party on how to gain an advantage at the expense of the other. So, for example, if you're a listing agent and you're aware that the seller will accept a lower price than the asking price, and then you're also representing the buyer, you can't encourage that buyer to give them guidance on how much of an offer to make like you normally would if you were a buyer's agent. You do a CMA, a comparative market analysis, to determine what the value of the property is. And if the property was overpriced, or you could encourage them to try to make a lower offer. But remember, you're representing both parties in the transaction. And when you're representing a seller, you're supposed to try to get them the most money. When you're representing a buyer, you're supposed to get them the property as cheap as possible. So you cannot really give them advice on that. So what you should do is just do a CMA for them, tell them that this is how much this property should be worth. How much do you want to offer? Leave it up to them to make that decision. Okay, you can't give them that advice on how or a strategy on how to price their offer. You could just, but you can give them that pricing valuation, tell them what it's worth, and they can make their own decision based on that, their own conclusions. So how to gain an advantage at the expense of another, you can't do that. And any confidential information you got to keep to yourself. If you decide to enter into an agency relationship with a firm which is working as a disclosed dual agent, you're advised to sign a written agreement with that firm, giving them that permission to do so. Now, nothing in the law tells you that you have to work with somebody as an agent, buyer's agent, seller's agent, or disclosed dual agent. You could also work as a transaction broker, which basically acts as a manager of the transaction without actually representing anybody in an agency capacity. So therefore, you don't owe fiduciary duties to the people you're working with. Also, let me note at this time, if you're working with somebody as a buyer's agent, seller's agent, or disclosed dual agent, the key word there in common is agent. When you're working as an agent, the people you're working with, you're representing, are called clients. If you're working as a transaction broker, the person you're working with is called a customer. We owe fiduciary duties to clients, not to customers. So a transaction broker, when working as a transaction broker, the New Jersey real estate licensing law does not require licensees to work in the capacity of an agent when providing brokerage services. A transaction broker works with a buyer, seller, or both in a transaction, just like any other agent would. A transaction broker does not promote the one party over the other. The licensee with such a firm would be required to treat all parties honestly in the transaction and act in a competent manner, but you don't owe them fiduciary duties. So basically, if you're representing both parties in a transaction, and you know, or even one party in a transaction, say you're representing a buyer, and you know that they're willing to go up on price. You could let the other party know that they're willing to go up higher on the price if you wanted, if you think that that is going to help make the transaction happen. Because as a transaction broker, you don't owe fiduciary duties of confidentiality. So if your client told you something in confidence where you're supposed to keep your mouth shut about it, if you think that disclosing it will help the transaction move along, well, then as a manager of the transaction, without owing fiduciary duties, you can do that. Okay. So a transaction broker can locate qualified buyers for a seller or suitable property for a buyer. They can work for both parties in the transaction and then do the negotiations as they see fit. So a transaction broker primarily serves as a manager of the transaction, communicating information between the parties, just like any agent would, and assist them at arriving at a mutual acceptable agreement and in the closing of the transaction. But they cannot advise or counsel either party on how to gain an advantage over the other. Owners considering working with a transaction broker are advised to sign a written agreement with the firm that clearly states what exactly they're doing in exchange for the money that they're going to be earning. And any transaction brokerage agreement with a seller or landlord should specifically state whether a notice on the property to be rented or sold will or will not be circulated in any or all MLS systems, multiple listing services, in which that firm is a member. Okay, so that's basically it. And then we just get the, if people then give us any pushback on this, we tell them, hey, this is not a contract. It's not, we're providing it for informational purposes only. We're asking you to sign it as an acknowledgement that you've received it only. And if you're working with a seller or the landlord, you basically fill out this section. If you're working with a buyer or a tenant, you fill out this section. You fill out this section always with your information. And then you're going to check off one of these boxes here, one of these boxes of how, as of this time, you intend to work with the client or customer. Seller's agent only, buyer's agent only, seller's agent and disclosed dual agent if that opportunity arises, or buyer's agent only and disclosed dual agent if the opportunity arises, or as a transaction broker only, or as a seller's agent on properties which the firm is acting as a seller's agent and a transaction broker on other properties. And then they date that as well. Okay. Now, when does it make sense to work as a transaction broker? I already spoke about this with you guys once before. Somebody asked a question on this. The transaction broker, say that I have two brokerage firms, a full service brokerage firm. Just say, for instance, we charge 6% all day commission. Okay. We're a full service brokerage firm. But we see that we're losing out on the people, the property owners who do not want to list their properties with us because they don't want to pay all that commission. It's understandable. It's a lot of money. So we open up another brokerage firm. I open up another brokerage firm to cater to the people who don't want to spend a lot of money, who don't want to waste the money on commission, who want to do things themselves, try selling on their own. So I create my own brokerage firm called Low Budget Realty, or forsalebyowner.com, something along those lines, similar to that. That's like what those websites do. Those are actual brokerage firms that cater to people who don't want to pay the high commissions. So we charge them a flat fee. We call these often a la carte agencies. So basically, you're going to pay a flat fee of, say, $600 to get your listing in the MLS. So I'm going to have a contract that's with them as a transaction broker that says, for the fee I'm earning of $600, we're going to put your property in the MLS, and we're going to forward all inquiries and appointments directly to your phone, and you could deal with them. Because that's all we're doing for $600. If you want us to set appointments and stuff, additional fee. You want us to sign, to create contracts, additional fee. So you got to specify what exactly you're doing on your contract when working as a transaction broker for the fees you're earning. In addition to that, you could also pay extra, and we'll give you a sign, a real estate sign to put on your front lawn. And for an additional fee, we could also lend you during the listing period one of our digital lock boxes, those blue digital Supra key lock boxes, to put the on your door so that other agents can show your property. But in order to put a listing in the MLS, it's going to be more than that $600 flat fee. You also have to offer what we call broker cooperation, which is some sort of other fee, like at least a percent, 1% of the sales price to the buyer's agent that brings in a buyer. Okay, you have to offer them something. Otherwise, we're not allowed to put properties in the MLS unless there is some sort of a cooperation, a commission offered for them. All right. So that encompasses everything about why we go over the CIS. It explains the different types of ways we could work with the public. And then we went over the informed consent to dual agency for the seller and for the buyer. And we went over transaction brokerage agreements and why it would make sense to work as a transaction broker, and that we'd have to have some sort of a contract in place that says what we're doing in exchange for the money we're earning as a transaction broker. Now, I usually work as a seller's agent only and disclose dual agent if the opportunity arises, or a buyer's agent only and disclose dual agent if the opportunity arises. So that this way, if I'm working with a buyer only, I say, hey, you think you may be interested in maybe seeing one of our company's listings? And at this point, they're going to be like, oh, I don't know. We don't know what you have listed. Okay, so as of right now, I'm going to work with you as a buyer's agent only. But if you're interested in seeing one of our company listings, well, our company's already representing the seller in that transaction. So we're going to be representing both parties in the transaction. Okay. So if you want to see any of our company listings and you want me to represent you, we're also going to need you to sign an informed consent to dual agency agreement, giving us permission to work as a dual agent. Okay. Because we represent our clients always. That's the way that I go about it. Some people, they will only represent one party in the transaction only. But I don't mind dual agency. I know how to keep my mouth shut. And if you tell me something in confidence, I could keep a secret and not go blab it to the other side. And I can treat people fairly and honestly and not place one party's interest above the other. Okay. I think that's about it for the CIS form. First document you give to anyone you intend to do business with. You should even have them at open houses. You intend to do business with anybody that walks in the front door of an open house? Yep. So therefore, this should be there right alongside your business cards and property flyers and your snacks and drinks that you may have set up there for people who come off the street. Okay. So that concludes that that portion, that explanation of the CIS, the disclosed dual agency, and the different types of agency. Any questions for me?